Marie Antoinette barely managed to escape to the king's rooms just as the crowd rushed into her bedroom and drove a pike through her bed. The crowd demanded that the royal family leave their palace and come to the city. I'm Professor Kate Williams, and in this episode of my History Extra Academy series exploring the lives of some of the greatest queens from history, I'll be delving into why the life of this French queen remains a subject of such fascination. Marie Antoinette was the 15th and last child of Maria Theresa, Queen of Hungary and Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. She was declared at her birth on All Souls' Day 1755 as a small but completely healthy archduchess. All Habsburg archduchesses were christened Maria in a tribute to the Virgin Mary, and so she was named Maria Antonia and Antoine in the family. As the youngest of her siblings, Marie Antoinette was considered a rather low prospect on the marriage market, but after smallpox took the lives of two of her elder sisters and cruelly the looks of a third who became a respected nun and abbess, Marie Antoinette was betrothed to the Dauphin of France. That's the name for the heir to the throne, the eldest son, and was sent to marry him when she was just 14. And at the border between Austria and France, there's an incredible scene where she's made to give up all of her belongings from Austria and even every stitch of her Austrian clothing, even her dog. This was symbolic. From now on, she was to be entirely French. In 1774, the old king, Louis XV of France, sickened. The Dauphin and Marie Antoinette were waiting in her apartments and they heard a terrible noise, exactly like thunder. This wasn't thunder, but courtiers who'd been waiting around the king's bedroom for news of the death. When he died, they came rushing to their new king and queen. It was the new regime. "We are too young to reign," they prayed. He was 19, she 18, and they were now at the head of Versailles and France. Suddenly, Marie Antoinette was not just Queen of France, but also the head of a household of more than 500 people. She was a symbol to be displayed and to be showed off to lead France, and everyone who spoke to her did so because she was expected to have the king's ear. Her brother, Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, wished her to influence the king to favour Austria. Marie Antoinette had a difficult line to walk. On one side, totally French, on the other, not forgetting her fatherland. She favoured a small group of courtiers, including the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac. The size of this hand-picked group helped stop the spread of gossip, but seasoned courtiers were annoyed about being excluded. The Queen preferred intimacy and was mocked for holding parties at her private farm. She was presented as playing as a shepherdess. But the real problem wasn't the farm. Plenty of aristocrats had a farm, and actually Marie Antoinette's was a working farm. It was that those aristocrats who expected a spot in the inner circle were not invited. And with her husband having little time for court circles and access to the Queen so in demand, some of those aggrieved aristocrats began to complain and spread rumour. At the same time, the French government was drowning in debt, mostly from supporting the American Revolution in the late 18th century. To make matters worse, their mechanisms of tax collection were archaic, the system was messy, and it simply didn't work. And while all this was going on, a bizarre scandal broke, the affair of the diamond necklace. And this affair of the diamond necklace made poor Marie Antoinette look pretty bad. It all began in 1774 when a con artist who claimed royal ancestry named Jean de la Motte hired a sex worker from Paris, Nicole d'Olivier, who looked just like the Queen. And Nicole was sent to meet a high-ranking church official and excluded courtier, the Cardinal de Rohan, in the gardens of Versailles at the dark of night. And Rohan was also a lover of Jean de la Motte. During this meeting, the fake queen asked the cardinal to buy her a necklace. What sort of necklace? A gigantic ornate piece that the old king, King Louis XV, had commissioned for his mistress. It's literally giant. Diamonds, probably from India, huge stones, tassels. It's not just excessive, ostentatious. It's totally out of fashion. The cardinal fell for it, bought the jewellery, and handed it over to Jeanne, who promptly disappeared with all the diamonds. The jeweller then asked the queen for the money to pay for the necklace. She was totally shocked. Of course she hadn't bought the necklace, and in fact she had been offered it multiple times, but she'd said, "I don't want it. The country needs ships more than jewellery." But when the jeweller shows up, the truth came out. The whole thing came out, and the king and queen were outraged. The suggestion that Marie Antoinette would have met a man in the gardens, the suggestion that she'd be so extravagant. Instead of hushing it up, they wanted a trial. The public used the scandal as an excuse to mock the queen, making her the scapegoat for the country's rising inflation and debt. Marie Antoinette tried to fix her image by commissioning portraits of herself as a devoted royal mother, but the public wasn't buying any of it. It's interesting, isn't it, how often queens in history try and present themselves as a mother, almost a divine mother, and the public say, no, we want that sexual image. The king took a desperate step prompted by the economic crisis and called for a meeting of the Estates General in May 1789, an assembly of the nobility, the church and the commoners that hadn't met for more than 170 years. The goal was to solve the tax impasse, but France's lower classes had very little representation in this assembly compared to the wealthy. Tensions were already at breaking point. A week before, there had been a riot in Paris over wages, and as many as 300 people were killed. As Marie Antoinette prepared to walk through the crowds in early May, she said, "I must go, like an actress, exhibit myself to a public that may hiss me." Amidst this growing sentiment against her, she faced a two-pronged danger from within her own court. While some of the aristocrats who led the way in the revolution were genuinely committed to the cause of liberty and equality and targeted the Queen as a symbol of rigid royal power, some were simply annoyed by exclusion from the royal circle and didn't want to pay taxes. Meanwhile, the poor were starving due to massive food shortages, often forced to spend half of their entire income just to buy bread. Realising the situation was turning violent, the king finally told his most hated courtiers to flee for their lives. Marie Antoinette was terrified and had to beg her close friend, the Duchess de Polignac, to leave Versailles for her own safety. The king and queen insisted on staying because they felt it was their duty, but with their household staff fleeing, they were left completely vulnerable. On Monday, the 5th of October, 1789, the situation exploded when a group of market women in Paris began a protest against food shortages. More joined, seizing weapons, and soon a crowd of around 7,000 had set out for Versailles. The Queen refused to share the king's room in order not to endanger him. She was the one that people were really coming for. At 4 the next morning, the crowds broke into the palace apartments. Marie Antoinette barely managed to escape to the king's rooms just as the crowd rushed into her bedroom and drove a pike through her bed. The crowd demanded that the royal family leave their palace and come to the city. Surrounded by angry people and escorted by the National Guard, the king and queen were sent to Paris to live in the Tuileries under pleasant surroundings, but a very restrictive house arrest. The royal family eventually planned a secret escape toward Montmedy near the Austrian-Netherlands border. However, the whole thing fell apart when their allies, who were waiting at posts for them, panicked and rushed away. The royal family was spotted, caught in the town of Varennes in their gigantic large carriage, and they were sent back to Paris to go to prison. While imprisoned in the Tower of the Temple in Paris, Marie Antoinette was subjected to absolute psychological horror when, after her friend the Princesse de Lamballe had been executed, the crowd took the head, put it on a pike, and had the hair done, so it was beautiful blonde hair, had the hair done, and then tried to wave the head on a pike outside the Queen's window, saying, "Kiss the princess." Fortunately, the overseer of the tower closed the windows, but the Queen could hear them shout all night long. The king was eventually put on trial and sentenced to death, and the night before, Marie Antoinette begged to see him one last time, but he declined that request. And then the question was, what do we do with Marie Antoinette? There was some talk of sending her overseas, but no, she had to be executed, and it was a done deal. Even before her trial, the Committee of Public Safety had decided she had to die to satisfy the demands of the crowd. They said, if they don't get the head of Marie Antoinette, they'll want to kill us. Unlike the king, she wasn't allowed to review the evidence against her in advance. Instead, her trial was filled with wild rumours and hearsay, including someone saying he saw some bottles under a bed in Versailles, which meant that clearly there were orgies going on. There were accusations of treason, sending information to Austria, and even abusing her son. But she defended herself. When accused of encouraging the king to flee, she explained she had no influence over the king's decisions. And indeed, this was the case. Women couldn't take the throne in France. They were only consorts, but she was seen as a symbol of repressive monarchy, excessive spending. She was sentenced to death and executed by guillotine in October 1793. She was 37 years old. And yet, if monarchy was such a threat to democracy, why leave her son Louis Charles to live? There had been other children killed by the revolutionary forces. Unfortunately, the poor child died of disease and neglect just a year and a half later. What about the king's brothers, who were the next in line to the throne, in fact, later would come to the throne? They'd managed to get abroad, and, well, they were abroad, but could easily get some agent or spy to kill them. But Marie Antoinette could never have taken the throne. She was no political threat, but the crowd had to have the head of the Queen. If they didn't, as Jacques Herbert had said to the Committee of Safety, they'd come for the leaders. For there is always one specific function of a queen. It's not just to be traded to create diplomatic bonds, to marry, to procreate, to head the court society, to support the king. It is to be hated. Detesting the king is too much. You never know. He might have been appointed by God, but the queen can be fully reviled, and so we have a situation in which the king's trial was fairer, the king's trial was kinder, and it was Marie Antoinette, who had no political role, that she was seen as the great horror and terror that had to be killed. Marie Antoinette had been raised and taught to symbolize monarchy by her mother. She was born to play the role of queen. She was at the top of Versailles, symbolizing the greatness of the French monarchy. But that became a problem. She did it so well that she had to die for it.